So this talk is called, as you can see, 100 Spliced Surprise Major, all the work, and subtitled "How You Do That," because and it's a story. It's the story about a simple story about this peal, rung 15 years ago, or rather, it's the story of a lot of peals. And years of effort that went into, that culminated in this performance. A lot of sort of blood and tears and sweat and ecstasy and disappointment. This appeal, when David Hull reviewed this in the Ringing World after it was rung, and he said it was probably one of the three most significant feats of ringing endurance at the time, along with the 72,000 of treble dodging minor and the extent of major at Loughborough. And I think you heard about the treble dodging minor a couple of weeks ago. So it all actually started from an extract from a speech I gave at College's dinner in 1998, when I said, I commit that before my year as master is out, this society will push 3 significant records so far out of sight that no one will go for them again in our lifetimes. And I added to that they would probably involve spliced. Now, I'd left myself some time because I wasn't actually junior steward even at this time. I didn't actually live in England. But I wasn't without ambition, and you're probably not surprised by that. I'm going to start off by saying a little bit about the genre, about ringing all the work Spliced Surprise Major, because it is a topic that a lot of ringers like. Why 23 spliced? There are 20. If you ring 23 methods, 23 times 224 is the number of rows in the course of surprise major. That is a peal. So, and all the work composition of 23 spliced has 23 methods in it, and you go all the way through the 23 methods with some bobs in the way, and you get to the end of what's called a part, and then you repeat it, and then you ring another 23 methods again, but you get different play spells for the second time. Then you repeat again. So basically, you go through it 7 times, and by the end of the peal, you've rung every single lead of every single method, and every bell has rung every single lead of every single method. So that's why it's called all the work. Nice thing about Norman Smith's, and this is Norman Smith's 23, which is sort of the first one there was, and you can see down in the bottom all that sort of code, which is the composition. Good thing about Norman Smith's 23 is you can build up to it. You can start off with a composition of 13 spliced, and then if you want to add a method, you ring 14. You might add 3 methods and ring 17, but basically you can ring all the numbers up to 23. So it's in a way it's quite accessible in terms of composition. And as I say in the top right there, Smith's 23 splice has been rung 821 times by 1,100 different ringers. So that's sort of 3 or 4% of all the ringers in the country have rung Smith's 23. Now, a useful feature of this form of composition that makes it slightly easier to ring is that you can, as long as you've learned the order of the methods, and it's well worth learning the composition, you will always know what comes next. So for instance, if there's a tricky method like Preston's, probably one of the trickier ones, halfway through your lead of Tavistock, you'll start thinking, okay, I'm going to be third place bell at the end of this lead, and you think forward, you think what your third place Preston's going to be, and you get that into your head. So when the conductor says Preston, it's not all of a sudden having to think within half a second what your next line is. You've already had time to think about it, and that is massively advantageous. It would be extremely difficult to ring a peal of 23 spliced if you didn't know what was coming next, especially if the methods are difficult. So that's in relative terms a relatively easy composition of 23 spliced. This is a much more difficult one. The other very commonly rung composition of 23 spliced, which is known as Chandler's. Chandler's, as I say at the top there, it's been rung 138 times by 230 different ringers. So that's about 1/5 as many times and about 1/5 as many ringers. Is it 5 times as hard? It's probably getting on for that. And the reasons that Chandler's is harder than Smith's is that most of the methods are wrong place, which you may be able to see by those grids. Most of the methods are wrong place, and most of the methods are tricky. whereas Smith's only really has two methods that are particularly tricky in Preston and Worley. There's a couple of unmemorable ones, but they're the tricky ones. Chandler's only has a couple of methods that aren't tricky. You'll see at the end there's a comedy lead of Pudsey at the end for some reason. So Chandler's is really quite difficult. But for bands who are used to ringing compositions of All the Work, Spliced Surprise Major, there are lots of people who know these methods off by heart. So that's a good thing to build on. So our initial target for this record was not 100. That would have been stupid. No, our initial target, the record was 45 at the time, and 45 spliced All the Work had been rung twice. Once originally, and then I was in a peal of it with the Essex Association, which is when I wrote these lines out. Not a particularly good composition. It puts a lot of really quite dull methods into Smith's composition, but it is of historic interest. No, so our target was beating this by ringing a 15,000, which meant ringing 67 spliced All the Work. Now, the composer I talked to about getting us a composition was Paul Needham, also a Birmingham ringer. And the brief that I gave to Paul was to use as many of the Smith's methods as possible and as many of the Chandler's methods as possible, and then to add in as many. Generally, I wanted interesting methods, not trivial. I wanted some really tricky ones, some easier ones, so we could have a bit of relaxation. But basically, that was the brief. And this is what he came up with for the composition of 67 spliced. And the methods in red are the Smith's methods, all 23 of those. And the methods in blue are the Chandler's methods. And the methods in black were new and were additional. And 9 of those new methods were unrung methods. So you might spot, the students of Spliced Surprise Major will spot that the structure of Smith's 23 spliced is there. And that's what Paul did. He took Smith's 23 and he inserted blocks, inserted round blocks. So if you look at that, if you look at Cambridge there, whereas in Smith's you normally go Cambridge, Cassidy, Bob, Lyndham, you can see we've got an insertion of Cambridge, then it's bobbed, Mulcaster Bob, Willesden, Esplanade, Sussex Bob. So 3 bobs on 427. And then you'll see another block is stuck in after superlative. And then an enormous long block is stuck in between Ashtead and Lincolnshire towards what would normally be the end of a part of 23 splice. You have this enormous sort of fugue of inserted methods. And right at the end, there's another couple of MX methods bobbed in between the Lincolnshire and the Pudsey. So again, in relatively terms, that wasn't looking unachievable, other than having to learn 29 new methods, because we sort of knew quite a lot of them already. So the question then was, what was the strategy for practicing and building up to this? Because just bringing that off straight off would have been hard. And to an extent, it's driven by how we learn. Now, but before that, of course, I needed a band. I'd got my composition, and the band was sort of specialists, certainly specialists of the day that were assembled for it. And we didn't want to ring all 67 methods in one go. So I asked Paul Needham to give us a set of 3 practice peals, sort of standard-ish length practice peals that we could build up with, which included blocks of the new methods in each practice peal. And because we knew lots of the other methods, we really only needed to practice the new ones. So you'll see, if you look at the composition on the right, again, students of Smith's will see that we jump. We're using a link section to get to the lead of Ashtead that you'd normally see in Smith's 23. So we use those 4 methods, and then ring that enormous block from the end through to the end. So it's just a nice way of getting an all-work composition, which was focusing in on all the methods that we needed. So this is actually quite a difficult composition and quite a difficult peal. And to be fair, it exposed a few weaknesses, which aren't going into too much detail about what those weaknesses are. But another story about this peal, you'll notice Eleanor J. Gippin ringing the treble in 2002. This was just about our first date. Obviously, a very romantic request to my then new girlfriend. Would you like to come and ring the treble to a peal of Spliced on Saturday? And of course she said yes. Quite useful, really. Now, the new methods there introduced another technique that we found was very useful, in that we named the new methods so that the starting letter of the method was the lead end group, because it really helps if you've got a method Beaumont Hill, you knew it was group B, Corbière was going to be group C, Ebenezer group D. So those are all of these new methods. I lived in Jersey at the time. All these new methods were being named after places in Jersey. We started learning them, except eggy bread, because I'd run out of place names in Jersey beginning with E, and I just closed my eyes and what was the first word to come into my head beginning with E, and it was eggy bread, which Paul Needham thought was a bit trivial. He thought we should rename it, but we didn't. Anyway, we got that one, and then the next day we rang that. That's actually gone on too far. Next day we rang that one on the Sunday the 21st at Bushy, and then so let's just go back. What you notice here, what was starting to become a feature of these peals, is that that's not all the work. So we didn't feel it was necessary to practice ringing all the work peals when we didn't have to, because all we were really testing was our ability to learn the methods and speed of recall. So we would ring compositions like this, where we'd ring a number of parts, and then maybe a part of Smith's or a lead of Yorkshire. So this composition here, Smith's composition, is essentially a plain course of Yorkshire Surprise Major, but with 4 courses inserted into it. So that's what we did. The following Sunday we rang another not all the work peal, and we basically then rung all the methods. The final practice for ringing 67 all the work, and a couple of things here that we started doing. This again, we'd now got to the point where we could ring all the methods. So we could ring a practice peal which was all the methods, but not all the work. So that would have been 2 very long parts. So 2 parts going through the whole part, 2 parts of 67. Which is 134, and then a part of Smith's to get us to 157, and then a lead of Woodstock, which is Yorkshire with an 8th place lead end, which would bring it round in a 5056. Another thing to notice there, David Brown couldn't make that one. We didn't force him to come to all the practice peals because he was cut above the rest of us. And Stephanie Warboys rang, and Stephanie would have just learnt the line of that rather than she'd know which parts she was getting. And would learn it. So quite a commitment to the cause, and she did that more than once, as you'll see. Now it was quite important. Sometimes we'd ring these knowing what parts we were going to get, so you could sort of run over the part in advance. Sometimes we did it without knowing what part we were going to get, which is obviously a lot harder. And I'll talk about how you go through parts, because that's a significant learning technique a little bit later. Now, I just want to think a little bit about how we learn, because different people, and I'll say quite a bit more about this later, because different people have different strategies for learning methods. You probably know, those who've learned a few methods, there's a common thought that, and you say you learn one method and you've got that in your head, and then when you learn another method, the first one pops out of your head again. Or if you learn 3 or 4, then by the time you've learned the first one, you've forgotten the first one. The 4th one, you've forgotten the first one. Well, everybody gets that, and to be honest, it doesn't matter, and you don't worry about it, because and it comes down to the difference between short and long-term memory and how short-term memory works. One of the members of this band, Robin Hall, he learns methods very well to start with. He might spend a day learning the first method to get it a little bit more concrete, and then the next day he would have that method and then learn the next one. Most of us would learn one of these methods in about 2 minutes. A more straightforward method you might learn in less than a minute, but sort of 1 or 2 minutes to learn a method, and then you go on to the next one, and of course, and spend a couple of minutes on that. And of course, then the first one will have got a bit hazy, but I would certainly learn methods in blocks of sort of 4 or 5. And you go through them. I go through the method as long as it takes to be able to recite it. and then I just park it and I go to the next one and spend enough time on that one until I can recite that one, and then the next one until I can recite that one. And once I've done a page of, say, 7, I will go back to the first one and I'll have forgotten it. But the second time you go through, it might not take me quite so long to remember that first one, because it's light grey and it's sort of a little bit of the detail comes in. And you go through the whole sheet again, and it takes slightly less time than the first time you looked at them. And then when you go back to the start again, it'll take you even less time to recall. And each time, on a sort of iterative process of learning methods a page at a time, they get slightly, I sort of see them as as if they're in shades of grey, and they get slightly darker each time you go through. And then once you can get through a complete page of methods, having done that sort of iterative, blasting them into your memory, then you put that page aside and you start the next page, and you go over the same process again. And once you've done that page, you go back to page 1, and of course that'll have gone a bit grey, and then you start going through 2 pages at once. So it's an iterative process, but all of us have that strategy. And another key thing, this is to illustrate a point. This is not from this particular peal, but this is what we do for any peal of Spliced, and this was a technique that almost all the members of this band developed independently at this time when ringing this peal. And what you're doing is you have a grid that shows you all of the leads of a part of the composition and the bells, and you start going through it. So I'd start off with this piece of paper, and I'd start with 2, and I'd have the lines to one side, and but you're basically going through in your head, and you say 2nd place Bristol, you go through 2nd place Bristol in your head, and you say that becomes 3rd place fauna, and then you think what 3rd place fauna is, and you go through that, and you become 5th place Hades. 5th place Hades, you go through it, and if you get a lead wrong, then I put a circle around it. If you get a lead right, you just cross it off. Get a lead wrong, you put a circle around it. And if I have a hesitation, so it's not absolutely spot on, then I'll put a dot over the top. And you basically go through the entire peal like that. Obviously, you're going through it a lot faster. It might take half an hour or 45 minutes or something to go through the whole thing. But at the end, you get a picture, hopefully, most of it with the leads with crosses through, but some circles. And quite often, the first couple of times going, you'll have circles all on the same line, because you realise that there's one particular method you don't know very well, like Aphrodite in this case. And you then focus your revision. You might get your lines back out. You'll focus on the methods where you've got lots of circles, and you might look specifically at the place spells where you've got dots above them. And then once you've had a bit of revision, you do it again. And then you start again, and you just go through every single place spell of every single method again. And the second time you go through it, you'll have fewer circles and fewer dots. And the third time you go through it, you'll have even fewer circles. And I'll tend to print 4 or 5 sheets, maybe 5 or 6. And by the time you've done it 5 or 6 times, you get through to having no circles and no dots. And you want to have achieved that the day before, basically. And then you know you can keep a clean sheet. You can't necessarily do it in practice, but at least you've got the confidence of knowing you know every line of every method. So we rang 67 all the work in June 2002 in just over 8 hours at St Thomas's, Oxford, and of course that was the record most surprise methods rung all the work. So we were quite pleased with that. But the following day, I was at the Bull Ring, and I saw Paul Needham. And I asked him quietly how many more methods he thought he could stick in it. And I initially asked him about taking it up to 90, which would have taken us past 20,000, which is a good next target. But I thought then that if we set the target at 90, that rather leaves the door open for someone thinking 100 is quite a good number. But Paul wasn't completely convinced he could even get to 90 sensibly. Because basically you're going over 20,000, 40,000, there are 40,000 different changes on 8. Asking for a composition of all the work Spliced Surprise Major with reasonable methods when you're using half the rows is really quite a challenging compositional effort. For some time it was thought that the only way of getting this number of methods, getting up to 100, would be to have sort of trivial variations of methods like Cray. But But Paul came back, and amazingly, he managed to do it. And he presented us with this. And the methods that are inserted there. So that's taking exactly the composition of the 67, because we sort of had banked that one. And he inserted 33 more methods. And because we're starting to run out of things that will work, and he was pushing at the boundaries of what was technically possible in terms of composition, all of these, all but 2, I think, of these new methods, were new and were unrung. So you can see there are just 1 or 2 incy-wincy problems here, because I mean, beggars can't be choosers when you're adding 33 methods and keeping it true, which meant that they weren't very easy. They weren't simple right place things. Some of them were really quite odd. Not all of them, but some of them were quite strange. And we went away. I didn't live in Jersey anymore, so I'd run out of Jersey place names. So we had a different theme here, and you can see what it is. It was quite helpful to be able to go around the Monopoly board in order, because it's just another way of remembering what method comes next. So you can see, and some of the Monopoly board methods were already named. There was already a method called Whitehall, which is why we got Whitehall there. There was always already a Strand, so we had Strand 220. There was always already a Bond Street, so we went for Bond 007. But basically that was the theme. So early 2003, a couple of warm-up peals on a Saturday to remind ourselves of some of the 67. I think there was actually one on the Sunday as well, which we lost. We didn't actually lose many peals in this build-up, only 2 or 3, and we rang some odd lengths. I mean, I think that's probably one of the only peals of 26 spliced that's ever been rung. But it didn't really matter, because we were just practicing. It was always all a means to an end. And then early February, we started adding in some of these methods. I've managed to find different treble ringers rather than Eleanor at this point, but we're adding in more methods. Eleanor had to ring inside. David Shepherd was let off for some reason, let off that peal at Trumpington. But there was a story there in that I persuaded Eleanor that she might like to ring inside instead. So she had to. I mean, and that's not a trivial composition of 23 splice by any means. There's quite a lot of methods that needed learning there, and she did, and she learned the 23 splice, and we were driving from Woking to Trumpington, which is long enough to go through lots of parts, and Eleanor was reciting them, and every single time she came to Tellurium, she got stuck. And Tellurium was a little bit of a bogey method, and she was getting more and more upset about not being able to remember Tellurium. And actually, when we were getting towards Trumpington, and yet another part had finished with Trumpington with Tellurium, the tears started to flow, and we actually had to pull over into a lay-by and have some reassuring team talk about how it's all going to be all right. Another feature there, you can see, you might have noticed all the previous peals I've called it of the 6th, which I just happened to ring the 6th in the first peal. But in that first peal at the Alton Morden, we'd learnt the concept of buddy bells, and I noticed ringing the 6th that I knew what the person ringing the 2nd was ringing all the time, because the 2nd was ringing the part that I'd just rung. So if you think about a lead of Yorkshire, when you're on the 6th in the course of Yorkshire, the previous lead you rang was a 2nd. So it also follows, if you're ringing a peal of 23 spliced or 67 spliced, the person who's ringing the 2nd is ringing the course that the part that the person ringing the 6th rang last time. So I found that I could always recall, because it was the lead I rang last time, I could always know what the ring of the 2nd was done. And we call that the buddy bell. And it was quite useful to say that the primary responsibility for looking after another ringer was the buddy bell, because the buddy bell would probably remember what they were going to be doing. So 3 and 4 are buddy bells. So I rang the 4th there to stand next to, and I would generally remember what the 3rd had done. So the concept of buddy bell is now used slightly differently in Splice Maximus, but we used it first in this composition. And then the Sunday afternoon, we rang another load of new methods. Notice that was on the back 8 at St Sepulchre's in London, 2800 weight. So that's quite a feat ringing a new composition of 23 splice on those bells. And Mike Trim came in and rang as a one-off a really quite tricky composition of 23 splice just to help us out. Getting bells did start to become a bit of an issue because we were quite geographically dispersed, and we needed places that were central. Sometimes we needed places at short notice, and just places we can get. We sometimes needed places for longish peals, and this wasn't the first time we rang a peal on a ring of 12, just because they were the bells we could get. And Willesden, there's going up to Willesden on a Friday night. Willesden was one of the places we could go whenever we liked, and they had the benefit of being light, which meant we could get there at 6:30 and still smash off a peal not long after 9 o'clock. Then on the right hand side there, we had to push the boat out and ring that 14 lead block all in one go. See, that's 31st of December. I mean, what a way to spend your New Year's Eve, ringing a peal of 39 spliced in steerage. But that was fine. And then we had 3 more practice peals early January. So we're starting to push the boat out now. 6,500 change peals. The one in the middle, just over half a peal. But what was happening here is we were ringing complete parts. So we're ringing complete parts of 100 spliced, either 2 parts, bringing it around with leads of Yorkshire or Woodstock, or that middle one is just 1 complete part rung on a Sunday afternoon, and then bringing it around with enough Yorkshire or whatever to do it, and then again at Meldrith another 2 parts of 100 spliced. And then we went for so with those practices we'd rung all of the 5 of the 7 parts, which was enough, and we went for the 100 all the work, not with an enormous amount of confidence, because these peals I remember weren't actually dead certs, and sure enough we lost it, and we lost it in the first part, when 2 bells swapped over. And one of the odd things about long peal ringing is that time travels at a very different speed. It doesn't feel like 10 hours or 11 hours when you're actually ringing, but it does when you're not. And if you lose a peal at 9:30, 10 o'clock in the morning, when you're expecting to be ringing all day, and you then have to cancel the umpires, because you've got umpires booked to be coming all through the day and through the afternoon. So you phone them up, say sorry, lost it. You go to the pub, you have a couple of pints, you have lunch, you go home, you get a few things done. I remember going home to Woking, lying on a bed, and at 7 o'clock thinking, we'd have still been ringing. And you just sort of think how long it actually is when you're not in it. It's how long it takes. But the toughest thing about this loss was just realising we'd had to do it again, and that I didn't think with that band we were going to get it. And that was a grim realisation, that we weren't going to get this record. And it was all to do with what was exposed was that some people just didn't have the ability to put these methods into long-term memory, and it was the difference between short-term and long-term memory, and we're going to look at that for a little bit now and see how significant it is. And this diagram does illustrate I'm not sure what the first bit is, sensory memory, but I couldn't find a diagram that missed that out. But anyway, the short-term memory box basically is only so big. Now, you can probably put 23 methods into short-term memory if you're an experienced ringer of Spliced Surprise Major. You could probably get 30 or 40 or 50 methods into short-term memory just about, but after that it gets very, very hard. And there were 2 particular reasons why we needed to get these methods into long-term memory and short-term memory wasn't possible. The logistical challenge of getting dates for ringers, for these ringers who are relatively booked up and doing other things, meant there could be quite a long time between attempts or bursts of attempts, which meant that you had to have the methods in your head for a long time. If you were only ever putting them in for short term, you'd be relearning them. So there was a necessity to have them in long-term memory. But also, critically, there's just too much information. Ringing 100 methods, it just could not be done in short-term learning. And that's what Paul and David, who dropped out of the band at this point, found, 2 of the best exponents of short-term memory in the business. But this couldn't be done that way. And putting this much information into long-term memory needs a lot of repetition. A lot of repetition and rehearsal, the word that's used there, maintenance and rehearsal. And unrehearsed information is lost, yes. And the constant going through it encodes it in your mind. My method sheets were with me every day. They were with me every day for several years. They were folded. It was a sort of A4 folded into 3. And my method sheets were molded to my chest from where they were in the inside pocket of my jacket. Just every single day, and I took them everywhere, and I would never be without them. So, but that's what it takes. It was looking at them all the time. I worked some distance away from home at that time, and I just learnt methods in the car. An hour there, an hour back, methods on the steering wheel, methods on the seat, whatever. Just constant repetition, encoding it into long-term memory. But we had to start again, and we had to start again with a slightly different crew. We needed 2 people as well who would come into this at the 100 splice stage, which is rather like coming into the high jump at the 2-meter mark. And there were probably only 2 candidates who could do it. And they see who came in, Philip Eris and David Pipe, both from Cambridge. So this is, so then there was a bit of an interregnum, a bit of a gap, and it was nearly a year before we started again. Now, remember that I'd made a commitment that 2 of the other records had been broken by this point in other things. And when I'd said that we were going to set 3 records before I finished being Master of the Colleges, I was Master of the Colleges by this point. And I only had till the end of November. So it was starting to look a little bit squeaky bum time. And Philip and David had to get up to speed pretty fast. Now, David describes that peal at Cripplegate as one of the sort of scarier but more fulfilling peals he'd ever rung. He said that Philip and David were a little bit behind the curve, as we say, on the train down to London. They hadn't actually finished learning all the methods. They were a bit nervous. We were a bit nervous. We rang the front 8 there, front 8 of a 12 on a midweek evening. I mean, flipping heck. But it was okay. Philip said he didn't really completely know the methods, but enjoyed the fact that he was sort of piecing it together, skating on very thin ice. But for the rest of us, we'd had a year off, but couldn't put the methods away. I decided to take about 5 months off. I did actually put those method sheets away. But Martin Whiteley, I think I saw come in on the call. Martin Whiteley told a story about going on holiday with David Brown. And going walking in Scotland, I think. And every single day, 6 months in between 2 peals of this, every single day, David would be reciting an entire part of 100 spliced to himself while walking. So that's the sort of degree of dedication and effort that goes into this sort of thing. See that peal of Bermondsey, David Shepherd came back for a sort of cameo reappearance. Anyway, 4 new practice peals, another 2 practice peals in April. Willesden yet again. Willesden is a very small ringing chamber. I wonder if one of those was when Philip had eaten an entire box of all bran, I think, and didn't we know it? One thing that made us difficult was we knew we'd have to ring the peal very fast, because otherwise we'd be ringing for 11 or 12 hours. So we wanted to go to light rings of bells and practice ringing really quickly. So here you see we're ringing at under a method, a lead, and that doesn't give you much thinking time, and it also starts making your handling get a little bit suspect, especially for a long period of time. So we rang those 2, and we rang 101 spliced, and we actually lost a peal of 100 spliced in the last part, where Stephanie Warboys had learnt an entire part of 100 spliced to help us during a practice peal. She'd learned the entire line, and we lost it because I think I rang a peal of Lincoln instead of a peal of Sussex right at the end. I didn't realise until a long time later quite how upset Steph was by that, and that was a low point. But the day dawned for the attempt, 23rd of May 2005, 6 months to go before I ceased to be Master of the Colleges. And St Mary's Willesden, one of the scene of so many of the practice peals you've seen. Which there are 22 practice peals at this point, and had lost 3. And this peal started off, going like clockwork. We were tapping along, and we'd rung for 6 hours, nearly 7 hours, into the 6th part of 7, and then one of the bells was accidentally rung down. And those who know what happened know what happened. And as we say, what goes on tour stays on tour. But we lost it. And I remember we sat in silence. We sat in silence there for a bit, slightly stunned. I think someone said sorry. And 7 of us went to the pub. And I'd started the day thinking this really was going to be the last time I had to look at all these methods. And then all of a sudden we were facing another 6 to 12 months of having these methods every day, and going through a part a day for longer and longer and longer. And that's a quote I like about this sort of stuff. I think it sums it up, because you've just got to pick yourself up. You just got to get going again. And the day after we lost that peal at Willesden, I was circulating dates with not too long to go. And we pulled out all the stops, and we found a date at the end of October in half term. We decided we just have to have a day off work, and ring it. I think it's and ring it at the end of October. And so again, we had a slight pause, but again, we're just going through it all the time. Fitted in a couple more practice peals, including one of 99 spliced, because we didn't think anyone would ever ring a peal of 99 spliced. And then we went to Loughborough Bell Foundry. We needed somewhere you could ring for 11 hours on a weekday during the day at short notice. And there's not many places you can do that, but Loughborough is one. Umpires, you have umpires for record peals. You have, I think we had 5 or 6 for this, and they tend to do stints for a couple of hours, and they come in, and there's a printout like this of every single lead of the peal and all the calls. Eleanor was judging at this point as the final judge. This is actually the final part, and the judges, the umpires tend to tick off, or they're required to tick off every lead and check that every call is made. You see there on the second column, tellurium. Robin Hall grins this time. That's because we all remember Eleanor's peal of tellurium with tellurium in it. Notice that there's bobs at virtually every lead end. So this is 10 hours. This part is 10 hours into ringing Spliced Surprise Major, faster than a lead a minute. So, yeah, and we all knew going into this, we could ring it perfectly. You'd have been through the entire thing the day before without making a single mistake. But in practice, you just can't do it. You just cannot do it because your memory. It's very tough on memory, and when you add them up, we averaged about 3 trips per 100 leads each. I don't think we had a clean lead of Cambridge until the last part. You just you switch off and you relax, and people always went wrong in Cambridge, but it was not too bad, because concentrating for this long is just so hard, and you're also aware that one serious error and you just lose the whole thing. So that concept of ringing fast made it quite tricky, because we had to ring quickly, because we couldn't really take more than 11, certainly couldn't take 12 hours, because we didn't think we could think for that long. So we needed it to be not too much over 10 hours, but that meant ringing on light ringer bells, which meant ringing very fast, which means the whole handling things comes into it. There's a risk of cramp in your fingers. I mean, what starts hurting? Your brain hurts. Your feet hurt because you're basically standing up and there's nothing taking the weight off your feet, which is different to ringing on heavier bells. Your fingers hurt. Your fingers hurt particularly because you've got small ropes and thin tail ends on the light bells. You don't really get hungry because you're concentrating so hard, and ventilation becomes critically important. And then you go through, and that gets to the end, and 10 hours and 48 minutes. Not too many trips in that last section, as you can see, and we got it. And as you get to the end, you sort of have a glimpse in your mind of the peal board, and you can see it on bell board, and you think you're going to get a few likes, and just we'd gone through. We'd married by now. We'd been through. Eleanor had rung so many of these practice peals on the treble, and finished off by umpiring the final thing. So we got it. So finish off, I just want to say now a few things about learning lots of methods. All of the members of the band said that they became better learners as a result of this peal, and developed strategies for learning spliced as a result of having to learn this. The incremental addition of methods is what everybody does. You just add one at a time and then go back, and the iteration of constant repetition takes it into long-term memory. It's quite one way of a couple of people in the band do is they try to not to learn all the method, to try and piece the methods together on the fly out of bits that they knew, because they felt that was sort of helped them. A few members of the band would start off with the placentation. I think 4 would start off with the placentation. Learning the first section of the placentation sort of sets it off, and you can sort of see the structure. I think 3 of us were sort of pure blue line learners, but the others would look at the structure first. It's very important that the learning and revision is really dedicated time. What we all found was that just sitting down in the corner, spending 3 hours learning methods was not very effective. You just get so bored. So you do it while you're doing something else. John Hughes Death learned his methods on a commute to St Albans every day. I learnt my methods commuting to Kent, where I was working all the day, and others. David Brown learnt his methods walking. So it's always learning whilst doing something else, usually walking or traveling. So you're not spending all of your brain on it. And all of our partners, wives, girlfriends, or whatever, were very used to the vacant stare, which was when you're pretending to be listening to other people, but actually you're going Spilsby, Beaumont, Belfast. You're going through methods in your head and pretending that you're actually listening. So the vacant stare was well known to our partners. The time taken to add new methods is definitely not linear. No, you can learn a method quickly. The next 5 methods will take 15 times as long. Adding 33 methods to 67 took a couple of years. It does get exponentially difficult to add new methods in. But after a while, you do get a few more building blocks. Once you know 70 or 80 different above works, you cease to get surprised by another one. And you start thinking, oh yes, I know a little bit of this method, because it must. Although we did all say we thought we were hitting a saturation point by the end of this. Going through parts, everybody is doing that. So the concept of picking one place spell, starting with the third, starting with third place Yorkshire, and then thinking and talking your way through the entire part of the composition. So going through every lead, 100 methods in order. And doing that once a day. Everybody was doing that, and that's absolutely essential for this. Theoretical perfection versus execution. Yes, we definitely learned that you had to know it perfectly, because in practice you just couldn't do it, because you just run out of brain. So the takeaway tips for those, if you're ever stupid enough to want to buy, well, just embarking on any sort of all the work, learning all the way compositions, there are some key things that make it easier. Learning the methods in order, absolutely. These compositions have the methods in the same order in each part. If you learn the methods in order, it helps with the association from one method to the other, and being able to associate the methods in some way is very helpful. Another thing that helps with method association is visualizing them on a page. So my page is of 7 methods per page. Others had groups of 6 or whatever. You start to remember where they are on the page, and that helps an awful lot to think of it that way. And all of the band did that. You don't worry too much. The thing about you learn one, the one you've just learned pops out of your head. You don't worry about that. You get to know that is just what happens, and you just keep going over and keep going over, and gradually you get darker and darker and darker. The 50 shades of grey turn into black, and you get there. 4 is a very good point. When you're revising, if you're revising for peal or splice like this, it is not sufficient to be able to recite a line of the method and then recite a line of the next method. It's not even sufficient to be able to recite the method and say where the play spells are. You've got to be able to pick the play spells out almost at random. So when we're rehearsing, you go through the play spells not in play spell order. So if you're ringing less ness, for instance, instead of learning you're going seconds and thirds and fifths, sevenths. Learn them in a completely different order. Do seventh place bell, then sixth place bell, then eighth place bell. And so you pick a different order to do it. Go seconds to eighths, or eighths to seconds. Another way of doing it is you go through all of the seconds place bells of every method, then all of the thirds place bells, then going through all the pivot bells is a really, really good test. If you can do that quickly, it proves it tests your recall. That grid of lead ends for practicing, so you tick methods off as you and you can see what you've still got left to know. We all do that, and that's a very common technique, and it's essential, I'd say. And that going through one part at a time, constant repetition. So there it goes, and so Yorkshire, just for memory's sake, Yorkshire Bob, Uxbridge Bob, Go, Old Kent Road Bob, Whitechapel Road, King's Cross Bob, Angel Bob, Euston Road Bob, Pentonville Road Bob, just visiting, Pall Mall Bob, Electric Whitehall, Northumberland Avenue Bob, Marylebone, Bow Street Bob, Cornwall, Double Dublin, Bristol, Whalley Bob, Watford, London, Tavistock, Glasgow, Cambridge Bob, Mulcaster Bob, Willesden Bob, Marlborough Street, Vine Street Bob, Free Parking, Strand 220, Fleet Street Bob, Esplanade, Sussex Bob, Cashierbury Bob, Lindham Superlative Bob, Malta Jubilee, Newcastle, Glamorgan, Essex, Columbium Bob, Wembley Bob, Rutland Bob, Jersey, Preston, Ipswich Bob, Trafalgar Square, Fenchurch Street, Leicester Square, Coventry Street Bob, Waterworks Bob, Piccadilly, Go to Jail Bob, Regent, Oxford Street Bob, Cray, Ashted Bob, Kingwood, Northampton Bob, Herefordshire Bob, Ebenezer, Spilsby, Beaumont Bob, Belfast Bob, Hertford Bob, Sonning, Tellurium, Buckfastleigh, Eggy Bread, Moulton Bob, Aldenham Bob, Corbiere Bob, Yedding Bob, Antioch Bob, Lone Star Bob, Chertsey Bob, Marmalade Bob, Claybrook Bob, Sir Isaac Newton Bob, Bond Street Bob, Liverpool Street Station Bob, Chesterfield Bob, Lulworth Bob, Lincoln Bob, Lamoy Bob, Petersfield Bob, Ardor Taylor Bob, Isle of Wight, Park Lane, Malpas Bob, Amersham Bob, Richmond Bob, Herefordshire, Newlyn, Oxney Bob, Lincolnshire Bob, Ditchling Bob, Herefordshire Bob, Butsey Bob. That's all.
Thank you, Simon. That was a really fascinating talk about a really fascinating project that you led on. And it's really and a really fascinating insight into the beginnings of your romance with Eleanor, like an episode of Love Actually. Thank you for that. And it was really nice to see so many people who have participated in your peals actually in the talk tonight. That was really, it's really nice to see people join in for that and clearly reminiscing about their time.
Eleanor's still there.
The chat box has been quite busy actually, and I just want to pick out a couple of comments, and obviously encourage you to have a look at that as well, and just to encourage everyone else on the call, keep adding to that chat box, or if you want to speak, just raise your hand or unmute yourself. I'll call you in just a moment. But interestingly, when you were talking about one of the peals that failed, Phil Ayres, I think, talked about of all the sort of 700 different place bells, the ringer was ringing thirds place bell Cambridge when the incident happened. And I think, it's interesting, isn't it, when you look at learning how you relax at something that's probably the easiest line, but actually that's where it all went wrong.
So Steph said she wasn't too miserable. Yeah. But what I didn't point out was we did ring one of those later practice peals. Stephanie did ring the 100 spliced then to complete having rung peals of 100 spliced on all numbers of bells from 6 to 12, which is quite a unique achievement.
Yeah. There's a story from Sam Austin around someone asked Stephen Chandler why there was Pudsey in the original 23 splice, expecting a really profound response. The answer was, I like Pudsey.
He likes it. Yeah.
And there was a question actually from James around the lead end grid. The question was, you had circles and dots, but there was some without. Can you remember what they?
Oh, that would only because that was from not having finished yet. That wasn't a completed sheet. It was just I just did that for example. Yeah.
Super. And then you had some comments about your performance at the end, performance poetry, and so on. Martin Whiteley, you've unmuted yourself. Is that because you want to ask a question? Do you want to?
Well, I wasn't going to, but now you give me the opportunity, I will. Thanks, Simon. That's been a very interesting talk. You've been quite modest about your additional role of being conductor, and I just wondered whether that did significantly to the challenge, or if in a peculiar way it actually made things simpler, because obviously you know exactly what's coming next, which is one of the important points you made earlier on.
No, no, I think everyone would know what was coming next. So no, I think I think, to be fair, it does make it harder. You just have that added. You cannot risk not getting to the end of the lead and suddenly having a blank, and suddenly forgetting a method, because some people might have gone to sleep. So you're desperately trying to make sure that you keep the next method, whilst ringing the method you're ringing in your head, whilst getting the next method in your mind ready, so that exactly at the right moment you say it. Because if you just go to sleep for 10 seconds, you can just have a complete blank. And then and lots of people will say, when you get a blank, especially if you're calling a peal as spliced, and panic then takes over, and you sort of blank out, and it's almost impossible then to remember. If you think you can't remember the next method, you haven't got a chance. And then you will. So no, it wasn't easier.
Super. Thank you, Martin.
And there were a lot of bobs. That last inserted block had a bob at all but 2 leads.
It's a bob course, isn't it?
Yeah. Thank you for that. David Baverstock says, intriguing that seeing the methods on a page is useful for this. And, he sort of compared it to when he looks at books when recording quotations, movement ideas for research and writing. Do you visualize where methods are on the page, or is that not really?
Yes. Yeah, I couldn't. I mean, I've got certain compositions of other things I can just see the page, and they might not be logical. I've got one where they're sort of almost in a circle, but I just see the page, and if you swap them around, it would make it a lot harder. And you get a lot of clues from that. Some people do it by adding a bit of color, I think, but yeah, definitely. And I wonder whether people who it's similar, I suppose, in memory to people who learn lines for a play. It must be just the constant repetition of going over. And I'm sure when you're learning lines for a play, people find the same thing, that if you can see the page of the play with your lines on, maybe it helps to see them on the page. I'd be interested to know, people who learn a lot of lines, how they do it.
Marianne, you've unmuted yourself. Is that a...
I have, yes. I have a really horrible question, and I'm sorry, because you probably skimmed over it tactfully. But there was the quotation in your presentation that it doesn't matter how many times you get knocked down. The important thing is that you get up again.
Yeah.
You also said that during the practice phases, it became clear that there were a couple of people in the original band for whom this was not a reasonable aspiration, and they resigned and other people came in.
Yeah. And
I was just wondering if it's nice to know if you're flogging a dead horse. And I was wondering if you could unpick a little bit more about how it was decided, how those people decided for themselves, or it was decided as a band that in its current formation it wasn't going to work. And
it would be unfair to do so. And it was extremely difficult.
Yeah, I'm sure it probably was. So yes, okay.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you.
Everyone's all friends, Marianne. Everyone's all friends.
Yes, I'm sure, and it is a dreadful question to ask, and I recognise that. But it's when one is struggling to memorise 8 methods, and you think, "Am I ever going to be able to do this?"
Yeah. And I think you could. I mean, we did question that thing. Will that record be broken? And I'm not sure. There's a sort of an unwritten code with record peals that you don't break people's records trivially. You don't come back and add a couple. You've got to add a reasonable chunk on the top. So I think if someone wanted to break this one, you'd have to ring 25,000. So you'd have to ring 100. I think that's 113 all the work. Now, it was hard enough getting that composition. I think you'd struggle to get a decent composition of 25,000 surprise major, which still had interesting methods and ringable methods in it. And I think it helps enormously that everyone in their sort of 20s and 30s already knowing Smiths and Chandlers. When you're starting off knowing 40 methods, it sort of isn't so bad to learn another 60. But there aren't so many people now, I'd suggest. Smiths and Chandlers just aren't off the cuff for as many people now, because people bring other things. So I think that the starting point is higher, and I think people would just go for something different. There are other things to be done without trying to crack this particular nut. But I think you could, if you've got a group of people who were up for learning Surprise Major, and you had maybe 2 or 3 weeks together and ran 2 peals every day, and were learning in the evenings, and maybe had a couple of hours over lunchtime to learn the afternoon's methods, and you did it that way, you could possibly do it over a 3-week block if everybody had that time off work and holidays and family.
Yeah, it's time and commitment as well, isn't it?
Time commitment and falling, yeah.
I suppose the question
It's a big ask for
phrased more positively in terms of other. Do you think it's a particular kind of brain?
That I think it must be.
Does it? Yeah.
It must be.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Marianne. We've talked about sort of visual looking at methods, Simon, on a page. But a question come in around, is there an element of hearing the sound of particular methods? So, for example, Simon asked, when learning vast chunks of music, you hear sounds long before they happen. Is there anything around that technique, or is it mainly?
No, I don't know of anyone who does that. I don't know of anyone who does anything orally, as in AU. I think I used to have a little bit of hearing me saying the line, sort of just the sound of repeating it and hearing that, and I certainly have that with the composition. The composition has a certain melody to it, and rhythm that I hear, but not certainly listening to in terms of notes. No.
Interesting question from Alison's. Alison Hodge just come in, and she asked, "Is there enough recognition for the composers compared to the ringers?" And actually, I didn't realise. I've known Paul for a number of years. I didn't know he'd composed this stuff. So there's an interesting thought there. No,
I think this is underrated. Quite how clever this composition is.
Yeah. Okay. Super. Lots and lots of thanks coming in to you, Simon. So please make sure you have a look at the chat box. I'll just do a quick sell for the next sort of this series of talks, really. And then if there's any last minute questions, any last questions, I should say, please obviously, pipe up before we end the call. So the next 2 weeks, we're going to have a break. We're going to have a Christmas break. So we won't be having any of these talks after that. We'll be back on the 6th of January for a quiz. So please think about joining us for that. And then after that, from the 13th of January, we have a full schedule of talks taking us right up until the end of March. If you're a guild member, obviously, you will get this information anyway. If you're not and you're interested in hearing about the talks, either look at our website. You're welcome to any of our talks, or drop me an email at the email I've just put into the chat box, smgcb@gmail.com, and I can add you to our mailing list for the Wednesday night talks. But I say it's a really interesting program, I think, that we've got organised, taking us right up until March. So you'll be very, very welcome to join us for that. I think that, unless there's any last minute questions that come through, I'll just give it 10 seconds to. Otherwise, I will thank you very much, Simon. It's a fascinating, as I say, a really fascinating insight into a fascinating project, and I really appreciate the time and effort you put into that. And
it's nice to remember it again.
Say again, sorry.
It was nice to remember it again.
Yes, and it'd be nice to get it as well.
Yeah.
Thanks ever so much, and lots of thanks coming into the chat box. So as I say, please make sure you have a look at that, and thank you everyone for coming tonight, and for people's support over the last couple of months with these talks. Without people coming along, it wouldn't happen. So thank you, Simon, and thank everyone else.
Thank you.
I'll stop the recording, and on that note, wish everyone a nice Christmas